Question 1. Market research demonstrates that financial services firms are increasingly adopting Linux-based infrastructure for its flexibility and performance. A Linux security engineer is tasked with deploying a new critical service that requires specific network configurations and user access controls on a Linux server. The engineer has received a proposed configuration from the infrastructure team, which they believe adheres to general Linux security best practices. However, the firm operates under the strict regulatory oversight of the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and adheres to the CISI Code of Conduct. The engineer is under pressure to deploy the service quickly. Which of the following actions best ensures compliance with both technical security requirements and regulatory obligations? Option A. Rely on the infrastructure team's assurance that the configurations are secure and compliant, as they are responsible for the technical implementation. Option B. Proceed with the deployment, as the proposed configurations are based on widely accepted Linux security best practices, assuming they will meet regulatory expectations. Option C. Verify that the proposed Linux security configurations align with the specific requirements outlined in the FCA Handbook and the CISI Code of Conduct, documenting any discrepancies and ensuring they are addressed before deployment. Option D. Deploy the service immediately and initiate a post-deployment review to ensure compliance with FCA and CISI guidelines, addressing any issues found retrospectively. The correct answer is C. Verify that the proposed Linux security configurations align with the specific requirements outlined in the FCA Handbook and the CISI Code of Conduct, documenting any discrepancies and ensuring they are addressed before deployment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between operational efficiency and stringent regulatory compliance in a Linux security context. The need to quickly deploy new services while ensuring all security configurations meet the exacting standards of the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and the CISI, Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, Code of Conduct creates a high-pressure environment. Misinterpreting or overlooking specific security requirements can lead to significant regulatory breaches, financial penalties, and reputational damage. The complexity of Linux security, coupled with the detailed mandates of financial sector regulations, necessitates a meticulous and informed approach to decision-making. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the proposed security configurations against the specific requirements outlined in the FCA Handbook, particularly CISC 001 and CISC 002 concerning operational resilience and IT outsourcing, and the CISI Code of Conduct, specifically principles related to competence, diligence, and acting in the best interests of clients and the market. This necessitates engaging with the security team to verify that all Linux security controls, such as access management, logging, patching, and network segmentation, are not only implemented, but also documented and auditable according to regulatory expectations. This approach ensures that the deployment is compliant, minimizes risk, and upholds professional integrity by prioritizing regulatory adherence and robust security over expediency. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with deployment without explicit verification against regulatory requirements represents a failure to exercise due diligence and competence, directly contravening the CISI Code of Conduct. This approach prioritizes speed over compliance, risking breaches of FCA regulations concerning IT security and operational resilience. Implementing the new service based solely on the security team's assurance, without independent verification against specific regulatory mandates, is a failure of oversight. While the security team's expertise is valuable, regulatory compliance is a broader responsibility that requires cross-functional understanding and adherence to documented standards. This could lead to subtle but critical deviations from FCA requirements that the security team might not have prioritized. Relying on generic Linux security best practices without cross-referencing them with the specific, often more stringent, requirements of the FCA and CISI is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Generic practices may not adequately address the risk appetite or specific mandates of a regulated financial entity, potentially leaving the organization vulnerable to regulatory scrutiny and sanctions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this domain must adopt a risk-based compliance-first mindset. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying all applicable regulatory frameworks and guidelines, FCA Handbook, CISI Code of Conduct. 2. Understanding the specific security requirements mandated by these frameworks for IT systems. 3. Evaluating proposed technical solutions, Linux security configurations against these requirements. 4. Documenting the verification process and any deviations with clear justifications and mitigation plans. 5. Seeking expert consultation, legal, compliance, senior security when uncertainties arise. 6. Prioritizing compliance and risk mitigation, even if it introduces minor delays, over immediate deployment. Question 2. Investigation of a Linux server's audit log configuration reveals that, while basic system access events are logged, there is no clear policy for log retention, rotation, or integrity verification, and the logs are stored locally without centralized aggregation. The organization is subject to regulations requiring comprehensive audit trails for security incident detection and compliance. Which of the following approaches best addresses the regulatory requirements and professional best practices for Linux security logging? Option A. Store all audit logs indefinitely on the local server, without implementing any rotation or aggregation, to ensure that all historical data is readily available. Option B. Disable detailed audit logging for non-essential services to improve system performance, assuming that security incidents will be detected through other means. Option C. Configure the Linux system to log only critical security events to reduce storage overhead, and rely on manual log review for compliance checks. Option D. Implement a centralized logging solution that aggregates logs from multiple servers, establishes a clear log retention policy based on regulatory requirements, and utilizes cryptographic hashing to ensure log integrity. The correct answer is D. Implement a centralized logging solution that aggregates logs from multiple servers, establishes a clear log retention policy based on regulatory requirements, and utilizes cryptographic hashing to ensure log integrity. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between maintaining system security and complying with regulatory requirements for audit logging and incident response. The Linux administrator must balance the need for granular, immutable logs to satisfy compliance mandates with the potential for excessive log volume to impact system performance and storage. Furthermore, the administrator must ensure that the logging configuration actively supports the detection and investigation of security incidents, a core tenet of many regulatory frameworks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory requirement for comprehensive audit trails while also considering practical system management. By implementing a centralized logging solution with appropriate retention policies and ensuring log integrity, the administrator establishes a robust mechanism for compliance and incident investigation. This proactive stance aligns with the principles of due diligence and demonstrates a commitment to security best practices mandated by regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on minimizing log volume without regard for auditability or incident response capabilities would fail to meet regulatory obligations. Such an approach could lead to insufficient evidence for compliance audits, hindering the ability to demonstrate adherence to security standards. It would also severely impede the investigation of security incidents, leaving the organization vulnerable and potentially facing penalties for non-compliance. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate system performance over logging integrity would be equally problematic. If logs are not stored securely or are easily tampered with, their evidentiary value is destroyed, rendering them useless for compliance or forensic purposes. This undermines the very purpose of logging and exposes the organization to significant regulatory risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of applicable regulatory requirements. This involves identifying specific mandates related to logging, data retention, and incident response. Next, assess the technical capabilities and limitations of the Linux environment. Then, develop a logging strategy that balances security, compliance, and operational efficiency. Finally, regularly review and update the logging configuration to adapt to evolving threats and regulatory landscapes. Question 3. What factors determine the appropriate Linux security configurations for a financial services firm operating under U.S. federal regulations? Option A. Industry standard security best practices and the personal experience of the Linux security administrator. Option B. The perceived threat landscape and the cost-effectiveness of implementing various security solutions. Option C. The availability of the latest security patches and software updates, prioritizing their immediate deployment. Option D. The specific requirements outlined in applicable U.S. federal financial regulations, the organization's internal security policies, and a comprehensive risk assessment of the Linux environment. The correct answer is D. The specific requirements outlined in applicable U.S. federal financial regulations, the organization's internal security policies, and a comprehensive risk assessment of the Linux environment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a Linux security administrator to balance the need for robust security controls with the operational requirements of a critical financial system. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying the relevant regulatory framework, assumed to be U.S. federal regulations for financial institutions, such as those from the SEC and FINRA, given the context of a Linux security exam, to specific technical configurations. Misinterpreting or misapplying these regulations can lead to significant compliance failures, financial penalties, and reputational damage. The administrator must demonstrate a deep understanding of both Linux security best practices and the legal obligations of the organization. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the organization's specific security policies, the applicable U.S. federal regulations, e.g., SEC Rule 17(a)(4) for record retention, NIST Cybersecurity Framework for General Security Controls, and potentially specific guidance from FINRA, and the technical capabilities of the Linux environment. This approach ensures that security measures are not only technically sound, but also legally compliant. It prioritizes a risk-based assessment, identifying critical assets and data, and then implementing controls that meet or exceed regulatory requirements. This demonstrates best professional practice by proactively addressing compliance obligations, minimizing legal exposure, and safeguarding sensitive financial data. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing security controls solely based on industry best practices without explicit consideration of U.S. federal financial regulations is professionally unacceptable. This approach risks overlooking specific mandates related to data integrity, audit trails, or incident reporting required by bodies like the SEC or FINRA. It could lead to noncompliance, even if the system is technically secure. Adopting security measures based on the personal experience or preferences of the security administrator, without a documented process tied to regulatory requirements, is also professionally unacceptable. This introduces subjectivity and a lack of auditable justification for security decisions. It fails to demonstrate due diligence and can be easily challenged during an audit. Focusing exclusively on the latest security patches and software updates without assessing their impact on regulatory compliance or operational stability is professionally unacceptable. While patching is crucial, it must be done within a framework that considers the broader regulatory landscape and business continuity. A patch that inadvertently compromises audit logging capabilities, for instance, could create a significant compliance issue. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process that begins with identifying all applicable regulatory frameworks and organizational policies. This is followed by a comprehensive risk assessment of the Linux environment, prioritizing critical assets and data. Security controls should then be designed and implemented to meet both technical security objectives and regulatory mandates. Regular audits and reviews are essential to ensure ongoing compliance and to adapt to evolving threats and regulations. Documentation of all security decisions and their justifications, particularly in relation to regulatory requirements, is paramount for demonstrating due diligence. Question 4. When evaluating the implementation of new security measures on a critical Linux production server, which approach best balances security, operational stability, and regulatory compliance? Option A. Focus security efforts only on systems deemed to have high business value, neglecting those with perceived lower value. Option B. Immediately apply all available security patches and updates to minimize the attack surface, assuming all updates enhance security. Option C. Prioritize the implementation of the most advanced and technically complex security tools, regardless of their impact on system performance or ease of use. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify potential threats, vulnerabilities, and their impact on business operations before implementing any changes. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to identify potential threats, vulnerabilities, and their impact on business operations before implementing any changes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a Linux security administrator must balance the need for robust security controls with the operational requirements of a critical business system. The pressure to implement changes quickly, coupled with the potential for disruption, necessitates a structured and defensible approach to risk assessment. Failing to adequately assess risks can lead to security vulnerabilities, compliance violations, and significant business impact. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic identification of potential threats to the Linux system, an analysis of the vulnerabilities that could be exploited, and an evaluation of the potential impact of such exploitation on the business. This aligns with best practices in information security risk management, which are often implicitly or explicitly mandated by regulatory frameworks requiring organizations to protect sensitive data and maintain system integrity. For example, under general data protection principles, organizations are expected to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk. A thorough risk assessment provides the foundation for selecting and implementing these measures effectively, ensuring that resources are allocated to address the most significant threats. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing security patches without a prior risk assessment is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the crucial step of understanding the potential impact of the patch on system functionality and security. This can lead to unintended consequences, such as service outages or the introduction of new vulnerabilities, which could result in regulatory breaches related to system availability and data integrity. Focusing solely on the most technically sophisticated security controls without considering their operational feasibility or the specific threats faced by the organization is also professionally flawed. This approach ignores the principle of proportionality in risk management, where controls should be commensurate with the identified risks. It can lead to misallocation of resources and the implementation of controls that are overly burdensome or ineffective against actual threats, potentially violating regulations that require a risk-based approach to security. Ignoring potential risks because the system is considered low value is a critical ethical and regulatory failure. All systems handling any form of data or providing any business function carry some level of risk. Regulatory frameworks often require a comprehensive approach to security, not one that selectively applies controls based on a subjective assessment of system value. This can lead to the exposure of sensitive data or the disruption of critical business processes, resulting in significant compliance penalties and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured risk management framework, such as ISO 27005 or NIST SB 800-30, as a guide. This involves defining the scope of the assessment, identifying assets and threats, analyzing vulnerabilities, evaluating risks, and determining appropriate treatment options. The decision-making process should prioritize understanding the business context and the potential impact of security incidents. When faced with pressure to implement changes quickly, professionals must advocate for a proportionate risk assessment to ensure that security measures are effective, efficient, and compliant with relevant regulations. Question 5. The performance metrics show a significant spike in failed SSH login attempts and an unusual volume of outbound network traffic from a critical Linux web server. Which of the following risk assessment approaches best addresses this situation while adhering to established cybersecurity principles and potential U.S. regulatory compliance requirements? Option A. Assume the alerts are false positives due to recent system updates and continue monitoring without immediate intervention. Option B. Immediately isolate the server from the network to prevent further unauthorized access and data exfiltration, then conduct a post-incident forensic analysis. Option C. Rely solely on automated security tools to scan the server for malware and automatically quarantine any suspicious files. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive risk assessment by analyzing system logs, network traffic patterns, and user activity to identify the source, nature, and potential impact of the anomalous behavior before taking any containment actions. The correct answer is B. Immediately isolate the server from the network to prevent further unauthorized access and data exfiltration, then conduct a post-incident forensic analysis. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in failed login attempts and unusual network traffic originating from a Linux server. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a rapid and accurate assessment of potential security breaches without causing undue disruption to critical services. The pressure to respond quickly, coupled with the need to maintain system integrity and comply with data protection regulations, demands a structured and informed approach to risk assessment. The correct approach involves a systematic risk assessment process that prioritizes identifying the nature and scope of the threat, evaluating its potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, and then determining appropriate mitigation strategies. This aligns with best professional practices in cybersecurity, which emphasize a proactive and evidence-based approach to security management. Specifically, in the context of Linux security and assuming a U.S. regulatory framework, e.g., NIST guidelines, which are widely adopted and influential in U.S. cybersecurity practices, a thorough risk assessment is fundamental to establishing an effective security posture. This includes identifying assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and the likelihood and impact of potential incidents. This methodical process ensures that security investments are targeted effectively and that compliance with regulations like HIPAA or PCI DSS, if applicable to the organization's data, is maintained by demonstrating due diligence in protecting sensitive information. An incorrect approach would be to immediately isolate the server without further investigation. This could lead to unnecessary service outages, impacting business operations and potentially violating service-level agreements. From a regulatory standpoint, such an impulsive action might be seen as a failure to conduct a proper impact assessment, which is often a requirement under data breach notification laws. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the alerts as false positives without corroborating evidence. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and could result in a missed security incident, leading to significant data breaches and regulatory penalties for failing to implement reasonable security measures as mandated by various U.S. laws and industry standards. Ignoring the alerts also represents an ethical failure to protect the organization's assets and the data entrusted to it. A third incorrect approach might be to rely solely on automated tools to remediate the issue without human oversight. While automation is valuable, it can sometimes misinterpret complex situations, leading to incorrect actions that could damage the system or overlook sophisticated threats. This also fails to meet the professional standard of informed decision-making and could be seen as a regulatory failing if it results in a breach that could have been prevented with proper human analysis. The professional decision-making process should involve 1. Initial triage. Quickly analyze the alerts to understand the immediate nature of the potential threat. 2. Information gathering. Collect logs, network traffic data, and system performance metrics to build a comprehensive picture. 3. Threat identification. Determine if the activity is malicious, a misconfiguration, or a legitimate but unusual event. 4. Impact assessment. Evaluate the potential consequences of the identified threat on data confidentiality, integrity, and availability, considering regulatory requirements. 5. Risk evaluation. Prioritize risks based on likelihood and impact. 6. Mitigation planning. Develop and implement appropriate controls, ranging from immediate containment to long-term security enhancements. 7. Documentation and reporting. Record all findings, actions, and decisions for audit and compliance purposes. Question 6. The monitoring system demonstrates a significant increase in failed login attempts across multiple user accounts on a critical Linux server, originating from a single external IP address. What is the most appropriate next step in the risk assessment process? Option A. Immediately block the external IP address at the firewall and notify all users whose accounts were targeted. Option B. Assume the activity is a false positive due to network latency or misconfiguration and continue monitoring without further investigation. Option C. Escalate the event to the Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, with a recommendation to shut down the affected server until the threat is fully understood. Option D. Analyze the pattern of failed login attempts to identify potential brute force or credential stuffing attacks. Correlate with other security logs for suspicious activity, and assess the potential impact on the affected server and its data. The correct answer is D. Analyze the pattern of failed login attempts to identify potential brute force or credential stuffing attacks, correlate with other security logs for suspicious activity, and assess the potential impact on the affected server and its data. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a security analyst to interpret raw log data and translate it into actionable risk insights without succumbing to the temptation of immediate, potentially superficial, remediation. The core difficulty lies in distinguishing between anomalous activity and actual security threats, and then prioritizing responses based on a structured risk assessment rather than reactive panic. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the fundamental principles of risk management and information security governance. By focusing on identifying the scope and impact of the detected anomalies, the analyst is engaging in a systematic risk assessment process. This involves understanding what systems are affected, what data might be compromised, and the potential business impact. This methodical approach ensures that resources are allocated effectively to address the most significant risks first, adhering to the principle of proportionality in security responses. Furthermore, this aligns with the spirit of regulatory frameworks that mandate a risk-based approach to security, ensuring that controls are commensurate with identified risks. An incorrect approach that immediately isolates all affected systems without a proper risk assessment fails to consider the potential for business disruption and operational impact. This can lead to unnecessary downtime and financial losses, which themselves represent a form of risk. Such an action bypasses the crucial step of understanding the nature and severity of the threat, potentially overreacting to benign anomalies. This can also be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence in understanding the business context of the security event, a key ethical consideration. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the anomalies as false positives without further investigation, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for potential security vulnerabilities. Regulatory frameworks often require organizations to have processes for investigating security incidents, and ignoring suspicious activity directly contravenes this. Ethically, it represents a failure to protect the organization's assets and data. Finally, an approach that involves escalating the issue to senior management without any initial analysis or context is also professionally unsound. While escalation is sometimes necessary, doing so without first attempting to understand the situation leads to inefficient use of management's time and can create unnecessary alarm. It suggests a lack of confidence in the analyst's ability to perform initial triage and analysis, which is a core professional responsibility. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, gather and analyze the available data to understand the nature of the anomaly. Second, assess the potential impact and scope of the anomaly on systems, data, and business operations. Third, determine the likelihood of the anomaly representing a genuine threat. Fourth, based on impact and likelihood, assign a risk level. Fifth, develop and implement appropriate mitigation or remediation strategies commensurate with the assessed risk. And finally, document all findings and actions taken. Question 7. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a newly discovered critical vulnerability in a widely used Linux kernel module poses a potential threat to several production servers. However, these servers host internal-only applications with no direct internet exposure and handle non-sensitive data. Which of the following approaches best aligns with a robust and compliant risk management strategy for this scenario? Option A. Prioritize patching based on the criticality of the vulnerability and the potential business impact, considering the specific context of the affected servers. Option B. Defer patching indefinitely, as the servers are not internet-facing and handle non-sensitive data, thus posing a minimal external threat. Option C. Immediately halt all operations on the affected servers to apply the patch, as the vulnerability is classified as critical. Option D. Implement a workaround by disabling the affected module entirely, without further assessment of the module's function or potential impact on system stability. Correct answer is C. Immediately halt all operations on the affected servers to apply the patch, as the vulnerability is classified as critical. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Linux security risk assessment, balancing the need for robust security controls with operational efficiency and the potential for unintended consequences. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and prioritizing risks in a dynamic environment where new vulnerabilities are constantly discovered and system configurations evolve. A failure to conduct a thorough and context-aware risk assessment can lead to misallocation of resources, the implementation of ineffective controls, or the introduction of new security weaknesses. The professional must navigate the technical complexities of Linux systems, understand the business impact of potential threats, and adhere to relevant regulatory requirements. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and iterative process of identifying assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and potential impacts, then evaluating the likelihood and severity of those impacts to determine the overall risk level. This aligns with best practices in information security risk management, often guided by frameworks like ISO 27005 or NIST SB 800-30. For a Linux security context, this means understanding the specific attack vectors relevant to Linux, e.g., kernel exploits, misconfigurations in services like SSH or web servers, privilege escalation techniques, the sensitivity of the data processed by the Linux system, and the potential business disruption. The process should involve both technical analysis, e.g., vulnerability scanning, configuration audits, and business context, e.g., understanding critical business function supported by the Linux systems. Prioritizing risks based on this comprehensive evaluation allows for the most effective allocation of security resources, focusing on the most critical threats and vulnerabilities. This methodical approach ensures that security measures are proportionate to the identified risks and contribute to the overall security posture of the organization, thereby meeting regulatory expectations for due diligence in security management. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing security controls based solely on the perceived popularity of a vulnerability without a formal risk assessment is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach is reactive rather than proactive and can lead to the misallocation of resources. For instance, a widely publicized but low-impact vulnerability on a non-critical system might consume resources that could be better spent addressing a less publicized but highly critical vulnerability on a system handling sensitive data. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to manage risk effectively, which can be a breach of regulatory requirements mandating a risk-based approach to security. Focusing exclusively on technical vulnerabilities identified by automated tools without considering the business context or potential impact is another failure. While vulnerability scanners are essential, they provide only a partial picture. A vulnerability might exist, but if the affected service is not exposed externally, or if the data it processes is not sensitive, the actual risk to the organization might be low. Ignoring this context can lead to overinvestment in patching or mitigating low-risk issues while neglecting high-risk ones, failing to meet the spirit of regulatory frameworks that require a balanced and business-aligned security strategy. Adopting a security by obscurity approach, where the primary defense is to hide system configurations or avoid known security standards, is fundamentally flawed and a direct contravention of regulatory principles. Security should be based on robust, verifiable controls, not on the assumption that attackers will not discover the system's configuration. This approach is inherently insecure, difficult to maintain, and fails to provide any auditable basis for security, which is a common requirement in many regulatory frameworks. It also hinders collaboration and knowledge sharing, making the system harder to secure in the long run. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach risk assessment by first understanding the organization's critical assets and the business functions they support. This is followed by a comprehensive identification of threats and vulnerabilities relevant to the specific Linux environment. The core of the process is evaluating the likelihood and impact of identified risks using a consistent methodology. This evaluation should inform the prioritization of mitigation efforts, ensuring that resources are directed towards the most significant threats. Regular review and updates to the risk assessment are crucial to adapt to the evolving threat landscape and system changes. This systematic, business-aware, and iterative approach ensures that security measures are effective, efficient, and compliant with regulatory obligations. Question 8. Governance review demonstrates that critical security risks have been identified within the existing Linux infrastructure, yet the IT department is under significant pressure to deploy new services rapidly. Which of the following is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance and maintain security posture? Option A. Proceed with the deployment of new services immediately, as operational urgency takes precedence over identified risks, and schedule a comprehensive risk assessment for the entire infrastructure at a later, less busy time. Option B. Conduct a cursory, high-level risk assessment for the critical areas to satisfy the governance finding, and then proceed with the deployment of new services without further detailed analysis. Option C. Halt all new service deployments until a complete, in-depth risk assessment of the entire Linux infrastructure can be performed, regardless of the impact on business operations. Option D. Initiate a targeted and expedited risk assessment focused on the critical areas identified, while implementing temporary mitigating controls where feasible, and proceed with deployment of new services only after the assessment provides actionable insights. The correct answer is D. Initiate a targeted and expedited risk assessment focused on the critical areas identified, while implementing temporary mitigating controls where feasible, and proceed with deployment of new services only after the assessment provides actionable insights. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in IT security governance, balancing the need for robust risk assessment with the practical constraints of resource allocation and operational urgency. The governance review has identified a critical gap, but the immediate pressure to deploy new services creates a conflict. The challenge lies in ensuring that the risk assessment, a foundational element of security, is not bypassed or inadequately performed due to time pressures, which could lead to unforeseen vulnerabilities and compliance breaches. Professional judgment is required to determine the most effective and compliant way to address the identified risk without unduly delaying essential business operations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing the identified critical risks and initiating a targeted, albeit potentially expedited, risk assessment for those specific areas. This aligns with best professional practice by acknowledging the governance finding and taking immediate, proportionate action. It demonstrates a commitment to a risk-based security posture, where resources are focused on the most significant threats. From a regulatory perspective, this approach satisfies the requirement to address identified vulnerabilities and risks in a timely manner, preventing a complete halt to operations while still ensuring due diligence. It reflects a mature security program that can adapt to operational demands without compromising fundamental security principles. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with deployment without any risk assessment for the identified critical areas is a direct violation of security best practices and likely regulatory requirements. It represents a failure to adhere to a risk-based approach, potentially exposing the organization to significant threats that were not evaluated. This could lead to breaches, data loss, and reputational damage, all of which carry severe regulatory and financial consequences. Deferring the risk assessment indefinitely until a less busy period is also professionally unacceptable. It signifies a disregard for the governance review's findings and a passive acceptance of unmitigated risks. This inaction creates a window of vulnerability that could be exploited, leading to a security incident. Ethically, it is a dereliction of duty to protect organizational assets and data. Conducting a superficial or incomplete risk assessment solely to meet a deadline is equally problematic. While it might appear to satisfy a procedural requirement, it fails to provide the necessary depth to identify and mitigate actual risks. This approach undermines the integrity of the risk assessment process and leaves the organization exposed, similar to not performing one at all. It is a form of compliance theater that does not achieve genuine security. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this situation by first understanding the scope and impact of the critical risks identified. They should then engage with stakeholders to communicate the findings and the necessity of a risk assessment. The decision-making process should involve 1. Quantifying the potential impact of the identified critical risks. 2. Determining if a phased or targeted risk assessment can be performed within a reasonable timeframe for the critical areas. 3. Exploring temporary mitigating controls that can be implemented immediately while the full assessment is underway. 4. Documenting the decision-making process, including any risks accepted due to time constraints and the plan for full remediation. This structured approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with both security objectives and business needs. Question 9. The assessment process reveals that several Linux servers in the production environment have outdated software packages with known vulnerabilities. However, these servers host non-critical legacy applications with limited external exposure. Which of the following approaches best represents a professional and effective risk assessment strategy for this situation? Option A. Document the vulnerabilities and plan to address them during the next scheduled maintenance window, assuming the low criticality and limited exposure make them a low priority. Option B. Immediately patch all identified vulnerabilities across all affected servers to eliminate any potential security weakness, regardless of the application's criticality or exposure. Option C. Implement additional network segmentation and access controls around these servers to further isolate them, deferring software patching until a more opportune time. Option D. Prioritize patching efforts based on the exploitability of the vulnerabilities and the potential business impact if they were to be exploited, focusing on the most critical systems and high-risk vulnerabilities first. The correct answer is B. Immediately patch all identified vulnerabilities across all affected servers to eliminate any potential security weakness, regardless of the application's criticality or exposure. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Linux security risk assessment, balancing the need for robust security controls with operational efficiency and the potential for unintended consequences. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and prioritizing risks in a complex, dynamic environment where vulnerabilities can emerge rapidly. A superficial assessment might overlook critical threats or recommend impractical solutions, leading to either a false sense of security or significant operational disruption. Professional judgment is required to move beyond simply listing vulnerabilities to understanding their potential impact and the context of the organization's security posture. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and context-aware risk assessment methodology. This means not only identifying potential vulnerabilities in the Linux environment, but also analyzing the likelihood of exploitation and the potential impact on business operations and data confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This aligns with best practices in information security risk management, which emphasize a proactive and layered defense strategy. By prioritizing risks based on their potential severity and likelihood, security teams can allocate resources effectively to address the most critical threats first. This approach ensures that security measures are proportionate to the risks faced and are integrated into the overall business objectives, rather than being an afterthought. Regulatory frameworks, while not explicitly detailed here due to the exam's focus on a specific jurisdiction's Linux security, generally mandate a risk-based approach to information security, requiring organizations to identify, assess, and treat risks to their information assets. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on patching known vulnerabilities without considering the context of their exploitability or impact is an incomplete risk assessment. This approach can lead to a reactive security posture, consuming resources on low-impact issues while neglecting more significant threats. It fails to meet the professional obligation to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of risk. Implementing all available security controls without a prior assessment of their necessity or potential impact on system performance and usability is inefficient and can introduce new risks. This shotgun approach ignores the principle of proportionality in security, which is a cornerstone of effective risk management and often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory guidance. It can also lead to operational friction and user dissatisfaction, undermining the overall security goals. Ignoring potential risks because they are perceived as unlikely or difficult to exploit is a failure to conduct a thorough risk assessment. Professional responsibility demands that even low-probability, high-impact events be considered and mitigated where feasible. This oversight can leave the organization exposed to catastrophic failures that could have been prevented with appropriate foresight and planning, potentially violating due diligence requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured risk assessment framework that includes 1. Asset identification, understanding what needs to be protected. 2. Threat identification, identifying potential sources of harm. 3. Vulnerability identification, pinpointing weaknesses that threats can exploit. 4. Likelihood assessment, estimating the probability of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. 5. Impact assessment, determining the consequences if a vulnerability is exploited. 6. Risk prioritization, ranking risks based on likelihood and impact. 7. Risk treatment, developing and implementing strategies to mitigate, transfer, accept, or avoid risks. This systematic process ensures that security efforts are targeted, efficient, and aligned with the organization's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. Question 10. The audit findings indicate that the Linux security team's current vulnerability management process primarily focuses on the sheer volume of identified vulnerabilities, without a clear methodology for assessing their potential impact on critical business operations or the likelihood of successful exploitation. Which of the following approaches best addresses this deficiency and aligns with robust risk management principles for Linux security? Option A. Focus remediation efforts on vulnerabilities that affect the largest number of Linux servers, regardless of the specific services or data hosted on those servers. Option B. Prioritize remediation efforts based on which vulnerabilities are most frequently reported by external security researchers or discussed in public forums. Option C. Implement a risk assessment framework that categorizes vulnerabilities based on their potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and their likelihood of exploitation, using a defined scoring system to prioritize remediation efforts. Option D. Increase the frequency of vulnerability scanning and patch deployment, assuming that addressing more vulnerabilities will inherently reduce overall risk. The correct answer is C. Implement a risk assessment framework that categorizes vulnerabilities based on their potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and their likelihood of exploitation, using a defined scoring system to prioritize remediation efforts. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a potential gap in the organization's approach to Linux security risk assessment, specifically concerning the identification and prioritization of vulnerabilities. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires not only technical understanding of Linux systems, but also a strategic, risk-based methodology that aligns with regulatory expectations and business objectives. The challenge lies in moving beyond a simple inventory of vulnerabilities to a nuanced evaluation of their potential impact and likelihood of exploitation within the specific operational context. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it emphasizes a structured and systematic process for risk assessment, which is a fundamental requirement for effective security management. This approach involves identifying assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and existing controls, then analyzing the likelihood and impact of potential risks. By prioritizing risks based on their potential severity, security teams can allocate resources efficiently to address the most critical threats first. This aligns with general principles of information security governance and is implicitly expected by regulatory frameworks that mandate a risk-based approach to security, even if not explicitly detailed in a specific Linux security regulation. The focus on impact and likelihood ensures that remediation efforts are proportionate to the actual risk faced by the organization. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the number of vulnerabilities, without considering their severity or exploitability, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach is a failure because it can lead to misallocation of resources, where minor vulnerabilities are addressed with excessive effort while critical ones are overlooked. Ethically, it fails to uphold the duty of care to protect organizational assets and data. Another incorrect approach, which relies on anecdotal evidence or the loudest complaints from users, is also professionally unacceptable. This method is subjective, lacks objectivity, and is prone to bias, failing to provide a reliable basis for risk prioritization. It ignores the systematic requirements for a robust risk assessment and can lead to a reactive rather than proactive security posture, which is a failure to meet due diligence standards. A third incorrect approach, which assumes that all vulnerabilities are equally critical, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of risk management principles. This leads to an inefficient and ineffective security program, failing to address the most pressing threats and potentially leaving the organization exposed to significant harm. This is a failure to apply sound professional judgment and adhere to best practices in cybersecurity. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with understanding the organization's critical assets and business processes. This understanding, then, informs the identification of relevant threats and vulnerabilities specific to the Linux environment. The next step is to analyze the likelihood of these threats exploiting vulnerabilities and the potential impact on the organization. This analysis should be documented and used to prioritize risks. Regular review and updates to the risk assessment are crucial to adapt to evolving threats and changes in the IT environment. This systematic, documented, and prioritized approach ensures that security efforts are focused, effective, and defensible. Question 11. The evaluation methodology shows that a critical Linux server has been compromised, leading to a service outage. The immediate pressure is to restore functionality as quickly as possible. Which of the following actions best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices for Linux security in this jurisdiction? Option A. Immediately restore the server from a recent backup that predates the suspected compromise, without performing a forensic analysis or verifying the integrity of the restored system. Option B. Isolate the compromised server and rebuild it from scratch using a standard uncustomified image, then restore only essential data without verifying the security of the restored data. Option C. Apply a quick, undocumented patch to the suspected vulnerability and restart the service, assuming the patch will resolve the issue without further investigation. Option D. Initiate a full forensic investigation to determine the scope and nature of the compromise. Implement targeted remediation based on findings, re-harden the system, and thoroughly test before bringing services back online. The correct answer is A. Immediately restore the server from a recent backup that predates the suspected compromise, without performing a forensic analysis or verifying the integrity of the restored system. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for system functionality with the long-term security posture and compliance requirements mandated by the regulatory framework governing Linux security in the specified jurisdiction. The pressure to restore services quickly can lead to shortcuts that introduce vulnerabilities or violate established security policies. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any remediation efforts do not compromise the integrity or confidentiality of the data processed by the system, adhering strictly to the principles of least privilege and secure configuration. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and documented investigation. This involves not only identifying the immediate cause of the compromise, but also assessing its full impact and implementing a comprehensive remediation plan that includes patching, re-hardening, and verification. This aligns with regulatory requirements for incident response and system security, ensuring that the organization can demonstrate due diligence in protecting its systems and data. It also supports the principle of continuous improvement by incorporating lessons learned into future security practices. An incorrect approach that involves simply reverting to a previous, unpatched state without a thorough investigation fails to address the root cause of the vulnerability and may reintroduce known security flaws. This is a regulatory failure as it demonstrates a lack of due diligence in incident response and system hardening, potentially violating mandates for maintaining a secure environment. Ethically, it exposes the organization and its stakeholders to continued risk. Another incorrect approach, such as applying a quick fix without proper testing or documentation, risks introducing new, unforeseen issues or failing to fully resolve the original problem. This can lead to further system instability or security breaches, violating the professional obligation to implement secure and reliable solutions. It also hinders auditability and accountability, which are critical components of regulatory compliance. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured incident response plan. This plan should include steps for containment, eradication, recovery, and post-incident analysis. Professionals must prioritize actions based on risk assessment, ensuring that critical security controls are maintained or restored. Documentation at every stage is paramount for demonstrating compliance and for future reference. Decision-making should be guided by the principle of secure by design and secure by default, even under pressure, ensuring that security is not an afterthought but an integral part of the recovery process. Question 12. Market research demonstrates that a development team requires rapid deployment of new features on a Linux production environment. To ensure system integrity and prevent unauthorized modifications to critical configuration files, which of the following approaches best balances security requirements with operational needs, adhering to established Linux security best practices? Option A. Implement a robust file integrity monitoring (FIM) solution alongside strictly enforced access control lists (ACL) for all critical system files and directories. Option B. Deploy a custom-built, highly granular access control system developed in-house, focusing on restricting all file operations for the development team to a minimal set of approved commands. Option C. Install a file integrity monitoring (FIM) agent and configure it to alert on any changes, assuming that alerts will be sufficient to deter unauthorized modifications. Option D. Rely primarily on comprehensive user training programs for the development team, emphasizing the importance of not altering production system files. The correct answer is A. Implement a robust file integrity monitoring (FIM) solution alongside strictly enforced access control lists (ACL) for all critical system files and directories. Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in IT security, balancing the need for robust security controls with the operational requirements of a development team. The challenge lies in implementing security measures that are effective without unduly hindering productivity or introducing unnecessary complexity. The pressure to deploy quickly can lead to shortcuts that compromise security, making it crucial to evaluate proposed solutions against established best practices and regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a layered security strategy, incorporating multiple, independent security controls. This aligns with the principle of defense in depth, a cornerstone of modern cybersecurity. By implementing both file integrity monitoring (FIM) and strict access control lists (ACL), the system benefits from redundancy. If one control fails or is bypassed, the other can still provide protection. FIM detects unauthorized modifications to critical system files, while ACLs prevent unauthorized access and execution. This combination directly addresses the security objectives of preventing unauthorized changes and maintaining system integrity, which are fundamental to secure Linux environments and often mandated by regulatory frameworks requiring data protection and system availability. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on a single security mechanism, such as only implementing FIM without robust access controls, creates a significant vulnerability. If an attacker gains sufficient privileges to disable or circumvent the FIM agent, the system's integrity would be compromised without any further barriers. This single point of failure is contrary to best practices and would likely fail to meet regulatory requirements for comprehensive security controls. Implementing a complex, custom-built access control system without thorough testing and validation introduces a high risk of misconfiguration or exploitable flaws. While the intent might be to create a highly tailored solution, untested custom code is a common vector for security breaches. This approach lacks the proven reliability and scrutiny of established security tools and protocols, making it a poor professional choice and a potential regulatory noncompliance risk due to the introduction of unknown vulnerabilities. Focusing exclusively on user training without technical controls is insufficient. While user awareness is important, it cannot be the sole defense. Human error or malicious intent can still lead to security incidents, and technical controls are necessary to mitigate these risks. Relying only on training leaves the system exposed to technical exploits and unauthorized access that training alone cannot prevent. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach security implementation by first understanding the specific threats and vulnerabilities relevant to the Linux environment and the organization's data. This involves conducting risk assessments and identifying critical assets. The next step is to consult relevant security frameworks and regulatory requirements applicable to the jurisdiction. Best practices, such as defense in depth, should guide the selection of security controls. Solutions should be evaluated based on their effectiveness, reliability, ease of management, and potential impact on operations. Prioritizing layered security, utilizing well-vetted tools, and ensuring comprehensive testing are crucial for building a resilient and compliant security posture. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a moderate risk associated with unauthorized modification of critical Linux configuration files. Which of the following approaches best mitigates this risk while adhering to professional security, best practices, and regulatory expectations for system integrity and auditability? Option A. Disable logging for all access and modification attempts on critical configuration files to reduce system overhead and simplify administration. Option B. Rely solely on periodic manual backups of critical configuration files, assuming that any unauthorized changes will be detected during routine system checks. Option C. Grant broad read-write permissions for critical configuration files to all users designated as system administrators. Option D. Implement file integrity monitoring (FIM) for critical configuration files and enforce strict access control lists (ACL) to limit modification privileges to only essential system accounts and processes. The correct answer is D. Implement File Integrity Monitoring, FIM, for critical configuration files and enforce strict access control lists, ACL, to limit modification privileges to only essential system accounts and processes. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in Linux security, balancing robust security controls with operational efficiency and user access. The professional challenge lies in interpreting a risk matrix, which quantifies potential threats and vulnerabilities, and translating those insights into actionable security policies without unduly hindering legitimate system use. The risk matrix highlights a moderate risk associated with unauthorized access to sensitive configuration files, a critical component of Linux system security. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the identified risk with a layered security strategy that aligns with established Linux security principles and regulatory expectations for data protection and system integrity. Implementing File Integrity Monitoring, FIM, coupled with strict access control lists, ACL, provides both detection and prevention mechanisms. FIM alerts administrators to unauthorized modifications, while ACLs ensure that only authorized users or processes can access or alter these critical files. This proactive and reactive combination is a cornerstone of effective security posture management, minimizing the window of opportunity for attackers and ensuring auditability. An incorrect approach that relies solely on disabling logging for these files is professionally unacceptable. This failure represents a significant ethical and regulatory lapse. By disabling logging, the organization forfeits its ability to detect or investigate any unauthorized access or modification, directly contravening regulations that mandate audit trails and incident response capabilities. This action creates a blind spot, making it impossible to comply with data breach notification requirements or to identify the root cause of a security incident. Furthermore, it demonstrates a disregard for the principle of least privilege and accountability. Another incorrect approach, which involves granting broad read-write permissions to all system administrators for these files, also fails to meet professional standards. While seemingly convenient, this approach violates the principle of least privilege, a fundamental security tenet. It increases the attack surface by allowing any administrator, potentially compromised or acting maliciously, to alter critical configurations without detection. This lack of granular control makes it impossible to trace specific changes back to an individual, hindering accountability and compliance with audit requirements. It also fails to account for the possibility of accidental misconfiguration, which could have severe security implications. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of risks identified in tools like a risk matrix. This evaluation must be followed by a thorough understanding of the specific Linux security controls available and their implications. Professionals should prioritize solutions that offer a balance of security, auditability, and operational feasibility. Consulting relevant security frameworks and regulatory guidance, e.g., NIST, GDPR, or relevant industry-specific regulations, is crucial to ensure compliance. The decision should always favor approaches that maintain visibility, enforce the principle of least privilege, and facilitate accountability. Question 14. Quality control measures reveal that a Linux development environment is experiencing a high volume of security alerts related to unauthorized access attempts and policy violations. The development team has expressed frustration with the current security configurations, citing them as a significant impediment to their workflow. The security team is tasked with re-evaluating the security posture of this environment. Which of the following approaches best balances security requirements with operational needs while adhering to professional cybersecurity best practices? Option A. Significantly relax all security restrictions and disable non-essential security services to improve developer productivity and reduce alert fatigue. Option B. Implement a comprehensive, multi-layered security strategy that includes granular access controls based on the principle of least privilege, robust logging and auditing mechanisms, regular vulnerability scanning, and secure coding training for developers. Option C. Focus solely on strengthening firewall rules to block all incoming traffic except for explicitly defined ports, assuming this will mitigate most unauthorized access attempts. Option D. Mandate the use of complex, frequently changing passwords for all user accounts and enforce strict lockout policies after a single failed login attempt. The correct answer is B. Implement a comprehensive, multi-layered security strategy that includes granular access controls based on the principle of least privilege, robust logging and auditing mechanisms, regular vulnerability scanning, and secure coding training for developers. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a common challenge in Linux security, balancing the need for robust security controls with the operational requirements of a development team. The challenge lies in implementing security measures that are effective without unduly hindering productivity or creating an environment where developers might circumvent controls due to frustration. This requires a nuanced understanding of both security best practices and the practical realities of software development workflows. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a layered security strategy that integrates security into the development lifecycle. This aligns with the principles of secure development and the regulatory expectation of proactive risk management. By implementing granular access controls, regularly auditing logs, and employing secure coding practices, the organization demonstrates a commitment to protecting sensitive data and systems. This approach is best professional practice because it addresses security at multiple levels, reducing the attack surface and increasing the likelihood of detecting and responding to threats. It also fosters a culture of security awareness within the development team, which is crucial for long-term security posture. This aligns with general cybersecurity best practices and the spirit of regulations that mandate due diligence in protecting information assets. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on restrictive permissions without considering the impact on development workflows. This can lead to developers seeking workarounds, potentially introducing new vulnerabilities or bypassing intended security controls. This approach fails to meet the professional standard of implementing security in a practical and sustainable manner, and could be seen as a failure to adequately assess and mitigate risks associated with user frustration and unauthorized access attempts. Another incorrect approach prioritizes convenience over security by disabling essential security features. This is a direct violation of professional cybersecurity standards and regulatory expectations for due diligence. It creates significant vulnerabilities, leaving systems exposed to known and unknown threats. Ethically, this demonstrates a disregard for the organization's responsibility to protect its data and systems, and could lead to severe compliance failures. A third incorrect approach relies on a single, often superficial, security measure without a comprehensive strategy. This creates a false sense of security and leaves critical gaps in the overall defense. It fails to address the multifaceted nature of modern security threats and represents a lack of professional diligence in establishing a robust security framework. This approach is professionally unacceptable as it does not demonstrate a thorough understanding of risk management or the implementation of effective security controls. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach, continuously assessing threats and vulnerabilities. This involves understanding the specific context of the environment, the sensitivity of the data, and the operational needs of the users. Decision-making should be guided by established security frameworks and best practices, prioritizing solutions that offer the best balance of security, usability, and cost-effectiveness. Regular review and adaptation of security measures are essential to stay ahead of evolving threats. Question 15. The assessment process reveals that the Linux development environment is experiencing frequent security alerts related to unauthorized access attempts and potential malware infections, while simultaneously facing pressure to accelerate release cycles. The security team is considering several strategies to address these issues. Option A. Deactivate detailed system logging and audit trail to reduce disk I/O and improve performance, and instruct developers to manually report any suspicious activity they encounter. Option B. Focus solely on strengthening the perimeter firewall by blocking all incoming connections from external networks, assuming that internal systems are inherently secure once the network boundary is established. Option C. Implement a comprehensive intrusion detection and prevention system, IPS, with real-time threat intelligence feeds, enforce strict SE Linux policies tailored to application roles, and establish a rigorous patch management schedule with automated vulnerability scanning. Option D. Disable all non-essential network services and ports on development servers, and implement a broad firewall rule that blocks all inbound traffic except for explicitly whitelisted IP addresses from known development team members. The correct answer is C. Implement a comprehensive intrusion detection and prevention system, IPS, with real-time threat intelligence feeds, enforce strict SC Linux policies tailored to application roles, and establish a rigorous patch management schedule with automated vulnerability scanning. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Linux security, balancing the need for robust security controls with the operational requirements of a dynamic development environment. The difficulty lies in identifying and implementing security measures that effectively mitigate risks without unduly hindering the agility and productivity of the development team. Misjudging the impact of security controls can lead to either a false sense of security or significant operational friction, both of which are professionally problematic. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a layered security strategy that prioritizes risk-based implementation and continuous monitoring. This aligns with best practices in information security, emphasizing proactive threat identification and mitigation. Specifically, implementing granular access controls through SE Linux or AppArmor, coupled with regular security patching and vulnerability scanning, directly addresses common Linux security vulnerabilities. The emphasis on least privilege and regular audits ensures that access is limited to what is necessary, reducing the attack surface. This approach is professionally sound because it is systematic, evidence-based, and adaptable to evolving threats and operational needs. It also implicitly supports regulatory compliance by demonstrating due diligence in protecting systems and data. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing overly broad firewall rules that block all non-essential traffic without proper justification is an incorrect approach. This is professionally unsound because it can cripple legitimate development workflows, leading to operational inefficiencies and frustration. Ethically, it fails to consider the impact on productivity and may not be the most effective way to achieve security, as it can lead to workarounds that bypass controls. Disabling security logging and auditing to reduce system overhead is another incorrect approach. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Most security frameworks and compliance mandates require robust logging for incident response, forensic analysis, and accountability. Disabling logging creates blind spots, making it impossible to detect or investigate security breaches, which is a direct violation of due diligence and potentially legal requirements. Relying solely on perimeter security without addressing internal system hardening and access controls is also an incorrect approach. This creates a false sense of security, as it assumes all threats originate externally. Internally, vulnerabilities can be exploited through compromised credentials or insider threats. This approach fails to meet the comprehensive security posture expected in professional practice and leaves systems susceptible to common attack vectors. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach to Linux security. This involves understanding the assets being protected, the potential threats, and the vulnerabilities present. Security controls should be implemented based on their effectiveness in mitigating identified risks, with a preference for solutions that offer granular control and can be integrated into existing workflows. Continuous monitoring, regular auditing, and a commitment to staying abreast of emerging threats and best practices are crucial. Decision-making should be guided by a framework that balances security objectives with operational realities, ensuring that implemented controls are both effective and sustainable. Question 16. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some users are experiencing difficulties accessing necessary system resources on Linux servers, leading to frustration and potential productivity loss. As the Linux security administrator, you need to address this feedback while maintaining a strong security posture. Which of the following approaches best balances security requirements with operational needs and regulatory compliance? Option A. Advise stakeholders that security is paramount and that any operational inconveniences are secondary to maintaining the highest level of system security, suggesting users adapt to the current access restrictions. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of access control lists, ACL, and user group memberships for the affected systems, correlating this with the specific resources users are reporting issues with. Based on this analysis, adjust permissions to grant necessary access, while ensuring that no user has elevated privileges beyond their role's requirements. Document all changes and their justifications. Option C. Immediately implement a blanket policy to grant all users read and write access to all directories on the affected Linux servers to eliminate any access-related complaints. Option D. Disable detailed security logging on the affected servers to reduce the volume of system messages that might be perceived as noise by users. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of access control lists, ACL, and user group memberships for the affected systems, correlating this with the specific resources users are reporting issues with. Based on this analysis, adjust permissions to grant necessary access while ensuring that no user has elevated privileges beyond their role's requirements. Document all changes and their justifications. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in Linux security, balancing robust security controls with operational usability and stakeholder needs. The professional challenge lies in interpreting vague feedback and translating it into actionable, compliant security measures without introducing new vulnerabilities or hindering legitimate business functions. Careful judgment is required to avoid overreacting to anecdotal feedback, while ensuring that genuine security concerns are addressed within the established regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, evidence-based evaluation of security controls. It aligns with the principle of least privilege and defense in depth, ensuring that any changes are justified, tested, and documented. This approach adheres to the spirit of security best practices by focusing on risk mitigation and continuous improvement, rather than hasty, potentially detrimental modifications. It also implicitly supports regulatory compliance by ensuring that security measures are proportionate and effective, avoiding unnecessary restrictions that could lead to non-compliance with operational requirements or data access policies. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on implementing broad, restrictive access controls without understanding the root cause of the stakeholder feedback is professionally unacceptable. This would likely lead to operational disruptions, hinder productivity, and potentially create new security risks by forcing users to find insecure workarounds. Such an approach fails to demonstrate due diligence and a risk-based methodology, which are fundamental to professional security practice and regulatory adherence. It also risks violating principles of proportionality and necessity in security controls, which are often implicit or explicit in regulatory guidance. Another incorrect approach that involves disabling security logging or auditing to reduce noise is a severe ethical and regulatory failure. This directly undermines the ability to detect, investigate, and respond to security incidents, which is a core requirement of most security frameworks and regulations. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the importance of accountability and forensic capabilities, leaving the organization exposed to significant risks and potential penalties. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the scope and nature of the stakeholder feedback. 2. Gathering objective data and evidence to understand the underlying issues. 3. Evaluating potential solutions against established security best practices and the relevant regulatory framework. 4. Assessing the risks and benefits of each proposed solution, including potential operational impacts. 5. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale for chosen actions. 6. Implementing changes in a controlled manner with appropriate testing and monitoring. Question 17. Benchmark analysis indicates that a critical Linux server environment contains sensitive configuration files that require restricted access. A recent security audit highlighted that current permissions allow broader access than necessary, posing a potential risk of unauthorized modification or exposure. The security team needs to implement a solution that enforces the principle of least privilege for these files, ensuring only authorized administrators can modify them while preventing access by general users. Which of the following approaches best addresses this security requirement in compliance with standard Linux security best practices and implied regulatory mandates for data protection? Option A. Set the sticky bit on the directory containing the configuration files. Option B. Create a dedicated administrative group. Assign ownership of the files to this group and grant read/write permissions to this group while denying access to others. Option C. Assign read and write permissions to the others category for the configuration files. Option D. Disable all file permissions for the configuration files. The correct answer is C. Assign read and write permissions to the others category for the configuration files. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in Linux security, balancing the need for granular access control with the practicalities of managing user permission across a growing server infrastructure. The challenge lies in ensuring that, while users have the necessary privileges to perform their duties, they do not possess excessive permissions that could be exploited for unauthorized access or data breaches. This requires a deep understanding of Linux's discretionary access control mechanisms, particularly file permissions and ownership, and how they interact with user and group management. The professional challenge is to implement a solution that is both secure and maintainable, avoiding overly complex or brittle configurations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves leveraging the principle of least privilege by assigning specific file and directory permissions to relevant user groups. This means that instead of granting broad access to all users or relying on overly permissive settings, permissions are meticulously set for the group that requires access to the sensitive configuration files. For example, if a group of system administrators needs to modify these files, they would be added to a dedicated group, and that group would be granted read and write permissions, while other users would have no access. This aligns with best practices in security and is implicitly supported by regulatory frameworks that mandate data protection and access control. By limiting access to only those who absolutely need it, the attack surface is significantly reduced, and the risk of accidental or malicious modification of critical system configurations is minimized. This approach is robust, auditable, and aligns with the security objectives of preventing unauthorized access and maintaining system integrity. Incorrect approaches analysis. Granting read/write permissions to others is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach violates the principle of least privilege by making sensitive configuration files accessible to any user on the system, regardless of their role or need. This dramatically increases the risk of unauthorized modification, data leakage, or system compromise, directly contravening regulations that require robust access controls to protect sensitive information. Setting the sticky bit on the configuration directory is also an incorrect approach. The sticky bit's primary function is to prevent users from deleting or renaming files in a shared directory that they do not own. It does not control read or write access to the files themselves. Therefore, it offers no protection against unauthorized modification or viewing of the configuration files and fails to meet the security requirements. Disabling all file permissions for the configuration files would render them inaccessible to legitimate administrators, preventing necessary system maintenance and configuration updates. This would not only be operationally unfeasible, but also a failure to implement appropriate access controls, as it would deny access to authorized personnel, while offering no actual security against unauthorized access if permissions were later misconfigured. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this situation by first identifying the specific users or groups that require access to the sensitive configuration files. This involves understanding the operational requirements and the principle of least privilege. The next step is to create or identify existing groups that accurately represent these access needs. Then, using commands like chown and chmod, permissions should be set to grant read and write access only to the designated group, while ensuring that others have no access. Regular auditing of file permissions and group memberships is crucial to maintain the security posture and ensure ongoing compliance with security policies and relevant regulations. This systematic approach ensures that security is implemented effectively and efficiently, minimizing risk and maintaining operational integrity. Question 18. Assessment of the most effective strategy for implementing granular user access controls across multiple Linux services, ensuring compliance with security best practices and regulatory mandates for data protection and system integrity, while minimizing operational disruption. Option A. Implement role-based access control RBAC and file system ACLs, coupled with comprehensive auditing and regular policy reviews. Option B. Grant all users requiring access to more than one service full administrative privileges to simplify management. Option C. Enforce a strict deny by default policy without understanding specific service access requirements, leading to potential user workarounds. Option D. Disable all security auditing features to streamline the user access management process. The correct answer is A. Implement role-based access control RBAC and file system ACLs, coupled with comprehensive auditing and regular policy reviews. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in Linux security, balancing the need for granular access control with the operational reality of managing user permissions across a diverse set of services. The challenge lies in ensuring that users only have the minimum necessary privileges to perform their duties, a core tenet of the principle of least privilege, while also avoiding overly restrictive policies that hinder productivity or introduce security risks through workarounds. The complexity is amplified by the need to integrate this with existing security policies and potentially audit trails, making a hasty or poorly considered approach prone to introducing vulnerabilities or compliance gaps. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and policy-driven method for defining and implementing access controls. This begins with a thorough understanding of the services and the specific access requirements for each user role. Implementing access control lists, ACL, or role-based access control, RBAC mechanisms, such as those provided by PAM, pluggable authentication modules, or file system permission, allows for precise definition of what users can and cannot do. Regularly reviewing and auditing these configurations ensures ongoing compliance and security posture. This approach aligns with best practices for secure system administration and regulatory requirements that mandate controlled access to sensitive data and system functions. It directly addresses the principle of least privilege, reducing the attack surface. Incorrect approach is analysis. Granting broad administrative privileges to all users who require access to multiple services is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This violates the principle of least privilege, creating an excessive attack surface. If a user account is compromised, an attacker would gain extensive control over the system, potentially leading to data breaches, system disruption, and non-compliance with data protection regulation. Implementing a deny by default policy without a clear understanding of legitimate access needs can lead to operational paralysis and encourage users to seek insecure workarounds, such as sharing credentials or exploiting vulnerabilities to gain access. This indirectly undermines security and compliance by creating shadow IT or unauthorized access methods. Disabling all security auditing features to simplify management is a direct contravention of regulatory requirements for logging and monitoring. Auditing is crucial for detecting suspicious activity, investigating security incidents, and demonstrating compliance. Disabling it leaves the organization blind to potential threats and unable to meet legal or contractual obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such challenges by first understanding the specific regulatory framework governing their operations, in this case, implied to be UK/CISI guidelines for financial services, which heavily emphasize data protection and access control. The decision-making process should prioritize a risk-based approach, starting with identifying critical assets and sensitive data. This involves 1. Policy definition, clearly defining access control policies based on job roles and responsibilities, adhering to the principle of least privilege. 2. Technical implementation, selecting and configuring appropriate Linux security mechanisms, e.g., PAM file permissions, SC Linux/AppArmor to enforce these policies. 3. Testing and validation, rigorously testing the implemented controls to ensure they function as intended and do not impede legitimate operations. 4. Monitoring and auditing, establishing robust auditing and logging mechanisms to track access and detect anomalies. 5. Regular review, periodically reviewing and updating access controls and security policies to adapt to changing threats and business needs. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows that a junior system administrator, tasked with resolving a critical performance bottleneck on a production Linux server, has inadvertently granted a standard user account elevated privileges through a misconfigured sudoers file. This has led to the user being able to execute commands as root. The immediate concern is to rectify this security exposure while ensuring the performance issue is also addressed. Which of the following actions best addresses this situation in accordance with secure Linux administration principles and common regulatory expectations for system integrity? Option A. Immediately revert the sudoers file to its last known good configuration and then investigate the performance issue separately using secure audited methods. Option B. Grant all users administrative access temporarily until the performance issue is resolved, then revoke it. Option C. Remove the user's account entirely to eliminate the immediate privilege escalation risk. Option D. Instruct the user to avoid using their elevated privileges and monitor their activity closely. Correct answer is A. Immediately revert the sudoers file to its last known good configuration, and then investigate the performance issue separately using secure, audited methods. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a critical need for robust security controls in a Linux environment, particularly concerning user privilege escalation. This scenario is professionally challenging because a junior administrator, while attempting to improve system performance, inadvertently creates a significant security vulnerability by granting excessive privileges to a non-privileged user. The pressure to resolve performance issues quickly can lead to shortcuts that bypass established security protocols, highlighting the importance of a structured and security-aware approach to system administration. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the principle of least privilege and the proper use of Linux access control mechanisms. Specifically, it requires identifying the exact command or configuration change that led to the privilege escalation and reverting it, or implementing a more granular and secure alternative. This aligns with best professional practices by prioritizing security and adhering to the principle of least privilege, which is a fundamental tenet of secure system administration. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing data protection and system integrity, implicitly or explicitly mandate such controls to prevent unauthorized access and modification of sensitive information. An incorrect approach would be to simply disable security features or grant broad administrative access to all users to fix the performance issue. This represents a severe regulatory and ethical failure. It directly violates the principle of least privilege, exposing the system to significant risks of unauthorized access, data breaches, and system compromise. Such actions would be in direct contravention of security standards and potentially legal requirements for maintaining system integrity and confidentiality. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the privilege escalation, focusing solely on the performance metrics. This is a failure to identify and remediate a critical security vulnerability, which can lead to severe consequences and is a breach of professional responsibility. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify and isolate the reported issue, performance degradation. Second, investigate the root cause without compromising existing security controls. Third, if a security vulnerability is identified as a contributing factor or a consequence of attempted fixes, prioritize its remediation according to established security policies and procedures. Fourth, implement the least privilege necessary to resolve the issue. Finally, document all changes and conduct a post-implementation security review to ensure no new vulnerabilities have been introduced. Question 20. During the evaluation of a critical Linux server, an automated security alert flags a suspicious process consuming excessive CPU resources and making unusual network connections. The system administrator is under immense pressure from management to ensure uninterrupted service for a major client. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Ignore the alert, as it is likely a false positive given the server's critical role and the pressure to maintain uptime. Option B. Reboot the server and restore it from the most recent backup, assuming the backup is clean and will resolve the issue without further investigation. Option C. Restart the suspicious process and monitor its behavior, assuming it might be a legitimate but resource-intensive application. Option D. Immediately isolate the affected server from the network. Initiate a forensic analysis to determine the nature and extent of the compromise, and then proceed with a secure remediation and restoration plan based on the findings. Correct answer is D. Immediately isolate the affected server from the network, initiate a forensic analysis to determine the nature and extent of the compromise, and then proceed with a secure remediation and restoration plan based on the findings. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it forces a Linux security administrator to balance immediate operational needs with long-term security best practices and regulatory compliance. The pressure to restore service quickly can lead to shortcuts that introduce significant vulnerabilities. Careful judgment is required to assess the true risk versus the perceived urgency. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, documented, and compliant remediation process. This aligns with the principles of responsible system administration and adherence to security frameworks. By isolating the affected system, performing a forensic analysis, and applying patches in a controlled manner, The administrator ensures that the root cause is addressed, the system is restored securely, and any potential data breaches or unauthorized access are properly investigated and reported, as mandated by relevant security guidelines and potentially data protection regulations. This methodical approach minimizes the risk of recurrence and maintains the integrity of the system and the data it holds. An incorrect approach that involves immediately rebooting and restoring from a potentially compromised backup fails to address the root cause of the intrusion. This could leave the system vulnerable to the same attack vector or a more sophisticated one. It also bypasses the critical step of forensic analysis, which is essential for understanding the extent of the compromise, identifying the attacker's methods, and fulfilling any reporting obligations related to security incidents. This approach risks reintroducing malware or backdoors and violates the principle of due diligence in security incident response. Another incorrect approach, which is to simply restart the service without investigating the underlying cause, is highly problematic. This is a superficial fix that ignores the fact that the system was compromised. The vulnerability that allowed the intrusion remains unaddressed, making the system susceptible to immediate re-exploitation. This demonstrates a severe lack of professional responsibility and a disregard for security best practices, potentially leading to further data loss or system compromise, and failing to meet any reasonable standard of care expected of a security professional. A third incorrect approach, which is to ignore the alert and assume it was a false positive without verification, is the most negligent. This demonstrates a failure to take security alerts seriously and a dereliction of duty. Security alerts are indicators of potential threats, and ignoring them without proper investigation is a direct violation of security protocols and professional ethics. This could lead to a significant security breach going unnoticed and unaddressed, with severe consequences for the organization and its data. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured incident response plan. This plan should include steps for identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. Professionals should always prioritize understanding the nature and scope of a security incident before taking action. Documentation is crucial at every stage. When in doubt, consulting with senior security personnel or incident response teams is advisable. Adherence to established security policies and regulatory requirements should guide all actions.